Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast, and welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
The following are the Mothman humanoid cryptid encounter reports collected by ufologist John Keel. The Mothman prophecies 2 years prior to the Silver Bridge collapsed on December 15, 1967. The bridge connected the towns of Point Pleasant, West Virginia and Gallipolis, Ohio over the Ohio River. Some of these reports are not from the area of the bridge collapse but seem to describe a similar entity. As well, some of the reports are from the general area of the bridge collapse but describe entities other than a Mothman-like being. Not all of these accounts were contained in the Mothman prophecies. Gallipolis, Ohio, early 1966 night, a woman who lived in a farm had reported her cattle being mutilated by unknown assailants. One night she went out armed with a shotgun to investigate and encountered several tall men wearing white coveralls. She chased them but they ran very fast and were able to easily jump over the fences. Point Pleasant, West Virginia, March 1966 daytime, a reliable woman said that she had observed a silver disc hovering above a Point Pleasant school. A male figure in a tight-fitting silver coverall was standing, floating, outside the open door of the object in midair, gazing intently into the school playground. He had pointed features and shoulder-length hair. A similar object, she said, landed sometime later in the yard behind her home, and was witnessed by her teenage children. A similar being was seen in this occasion as well. Salt Lake City, Utah, July 18, 1966, residents of this Mormon community reported seeing a bird, about as big as a Piper Cub airplane, circle the area. Some people ran for cover while others ran for their telephones. Scott, Mississippi, September 1, 1966 2 p.m., Mrs. James Eichert reported seeing what looked like a man fluttering about the sky. Several other people also said they had seen it. No other information. Point Pleasant, West Virginia, November 1, 1966, a National Guardsman saw a large brownish man-shaped figure on the limb of a tree. No other information. Gallipolis, Ohio, November 2, 1966 8 p.m., the witness was out behind her building getting ready to go home when there was a sudden flash directly above her. A large cylinder-shaped object then appeared and landed on the nearby parking lot. The object was completely silent, and the witness was unable to move as two men descended from the object and walked towards her. The men were normal-looking but heavily tanned with pointed noses, pointed chins, and high cheekbones. They wore coverall-like uniforms. They asked the witness several mundane questions using a sing-song high-pitched voice. They then walked back to their craft, which took off at high speed. The witness lived in a farm and had been having problems with missing cattle around the same time. Near Parkersburg, West Virginia, November 2, 1966 night, two men traveling by car on Highway 77 watched an elongated object descend from the sky directly in front of their vehicle. They stopped the car and saw a man emerged from the object and walk over to them. The man was human-looking and was grinning broadly. He was wearing a black coat and kept his arms folded out of sight under his armpits. The black-garbed stranger asked them several pointless questions before returning to the dark cylinder-shaped craft, which quickly rose and disappeared into the sky. This incident occurred on the same night as the Woodrow Durenberger contact landing case in the same general area. Clendenin, West Virginia, November 12, 1966 daytime, 5 men were digging a grave in a cemetery near Clendenin when something that looked like a brown human being fluttered from some nearby trees and maneuvered low over their heads. It was in sight for about a minute. Salem, West Virginia, November 14, 1966 10:30 p.m., Newell Partridge was sitting at home when suddenly the TV blanked out. A real fine herringbone pattern appeared on the tube, and at the same time the set started a loud whining noise, winding up to a high pitch, peaking and breaking off, as if you were on a musical scale. It sounded like a generator winding up. Outside on the porch, his dog Bandit began wailing. Partridge picked up a flashlight and went outside to investigate. The dog was sitting at the end of the porch, howling down toward the hay barn in the bottom. Partridge shined the light in that direction, and it picked up 2 red circles, or eyes, which looked like bicycle reflectors. There was something about the eyes that was difficult to explain. The eyes were huge, plainly visible at a distance of 150 yards. As soon as the flashlight picked out the eyes, Bandit snarled and ran toward them. A cold chill swept over the man and he felt a wave of fear, which kept him from following the dog. That night he slept with a loaded gun beside his bed. The next day he went looking for his dog. They found tracks. At the approximate position of the eyes, he found a large number of dog tracks. The tracks were going in a circle, as if the dog had been chasing his tail. Then the tracks vanished, the dog was never seen again. Point Pleasant, West Virginia, November 16, 1966, 9 p.m. Mr. and Mrs. Raymond Walmsley and Mrs. Marcella Bennett were driving to the house of Ralph Thomas. They saw a big red light maneuvering over the TNT dump area. When they arrived and got out, a big gray thing bigger than a man, with glowing red eyes, rose up from the ground. They ran into the house, but the creature shuffled onto the porch and peered into windows. It was gone by the time police arrived. Point Pleasant, West Virginia, November 16, 1966, midnight. Mr. and Mrs. Steve Millett and Mr. and Mrs. Roger Scarberry reported that their car was followed about midnight by a gray, bird-like creature, 6 to 7 feet tall with a 10-foot wingspan. When the car headlights struck, its eyes, 2 inches in diameter, glowed red. It finally scurried into a field and disappeared. Cheshire, Ohio, November 17, 1966 night. On Route 7, a gray man-shaped creature with red eyes and a 10-foot wingspread pursued a boy's car. No other information. Point Pleasant, West Virginia, November 18, 1966 night. Captain Paul Yoder and B. Knox saw a huge bird-like creature, with big red eyes, in the TNT dump area. No other information. Campbell's Creek, West Virginia, November 20, 1966. 6 teenagers saw a gray man-sized creature with red eyes flying over the area. No other information. Charleston, West Virginia, November 21, 1966, 10:15 p.m. Richard West called police to report that a Batman was sitting on a roof next to his house. It looks like a man 6 feet tall and has a wingspread of 6 to 8 feet, he said. It had great big red eyes. It flew straight up like a helicopter. Point Pleasant, West Virginia, November 24, 1966, 7:15 a.m. Mr. Thomas Urey was driving home in daylight when the Mothman, a bird-like creature 6 feet tall and with a 10-foot wing spread, circled over his car. He speeded up to 70 to 75 miles per hour, but it kept up with him. He had been in the area of the TNT dump site. Point Pleasant, West Virginia, November 24, 1966 night. Mary Maya, a reporter, saw the glowing red eyes of the Mothman when she visited an abandoned power plant in Point Pleasant, where it had been seen before. Here are a ton of reports, hope someone out there enjoys reading them. St. Albans, West Virginia, November 26, 1966 evening. Mrs. Ruth Foster saw the Mothman standing on her front lawn. It was about 6 feet tall and had a funny little face with big red eyes that popped out. She screamed and ran into the house. New Haven, West Virginia, November 27, 1966, 10:30 a.m. Miss Connie Carpenter saw the Mothman, a tall figure in gray, standing on a golf course. It unfolded 10-foot wings and flew directly at her windshield. She saw its red eyes, then it veered off and disappeared. Her eyes were red, swollen, and itchy for 2 weeks afterwards. St. Albans, West Virginia, November 27, 1966 night. 13-year-old Sheila Kane and her sister were walking home when they saw a being standing by the road. It was 7 feet tall, and gray and white with big red eyes. They screamed and ran home. It flew low over them. Gallipolis, Ohio, December 4, 1966 3 p.m. At the Gallipolis airport, 5 pilots saw what at first they took for an airplane. It was a winged form about 300 feet up, traveling at 70 miles per hour without flapping its wide wings. It had a long neck and was turning its head from side to side. Point Pleasant, West Virginia, December 6, 1966 night. 2 adults, one a high school teacher, were driving near the local TNT dump site when they saw a giant gray man-like figure with glowing red eyes. Near Gallipolis, Ohio, December 7, 1966 night. 4 women driving on Route 33 saw a brownish-silver man-shaped flying creature with glowing red eyes. No other information. Point Pleasant, West Virginia, January 11, 1967 daytime. Mrs. Park McDaniel was outside her home when she saw what she first took to be a small plane approaching. As it drew closer, she saw it was man-shaped and had wings. The creature swooped low over the witness and circled above a nearby building before going out of sight. Point Pleasant, West Virginia, spring 1967 several local residents saw 3 very tall, dark-complexioned men in the area. These men knocked on doors late at night, purportedly selling magazines. They spoke fluent unaccented English and were described as good-looking, with heavily tanned skin. Their height and broadness impressed the witnesses the most. These men were always on foot. Apparently they did not have a car. Bogle Ridge, West Virginia, March 1967 late night. A man and a woman were out parked in an isolated area, sky watching, when they saw a group of red, green and white lights descend from the sky and land in a nearby gully. Moments later there was a bright flash of light and the man's face began tingling. He then heard voices outside the car and there was a sudden knock on the car window. Outside they both saw a man holding a red light standing by the car. Using mental telepathy, the strange figure asked the male witness several questions, then told him to leave the car. The witness was then led off into the darkness. Several personal items were missing from the witness upon returning to the vehicle. Point Pleasant, West Virginia, March 1967 late night. 16-year-old Linda Lilly woke up one night and saw a large figure towering over her bed. It was a man, she said. A big man. Very broad. I couldn't see his face very well, but I could see that he was grinning at me. Linda got up from bed with a terrible scream. She cried out there was a man in her room. He walked around the bed and stood right over me. Linda declared, I screamed again and hid under the covers. When I looked again, he was gone. She then ran into her mother's room. When asked for a full description of the man, Linda said she thought he had been wearing a checkered shirt. Around the same time, her mother, Doris Lilly, began to receive strange phone calls at home. Each evening around 1700 her phone would ring, and when she answered she heard only a bizarre metallic voice speaking in an incomprehensible language. It was guttural and rapid. These calls came only when she was alone. Near Chief Cornstalk Hunting Grounds, West Virginia, April 1967 night. On a rainy night a man was driving along Route 2 when a large black form rose from the woods and flew over his car. It was at least 10 feet wide, he claimed. He stepped on the gas, but it kept right up with him at about 70 miles per hour. It then moved ahead of him and turned toward the river. Near Gallipolis Ferry, West Virginia, April 7, 1967 11:15 p.m., Mabel McDaniel, John Keel, and 2 other women went to a hill when they spotted the usual reddish glow on a nearby hill. A second one popped up a short distance from the first. Keel flashed his light at them, but nothing happened. So, he climbed a fence and walked into a field to try to get a closer look. As he crossed the field, he suddenly noticed a pale bluish ball of light hovering high in the trees of an orchard behind the nearby farmhouse. The light moved about from tree to tree as though it were following Keel's movements. He flashed his light at it, and it flared with a dazzling brilliance, dimmed, and vanished. The lights on the southern ridge also brightened for a moment and then went out. Coming back to the car, Keel found all three women in a very frightened state. Later they related how they had seen a very tall man in the field, which climbed over a fence then crossed behind their vehicle. Terrified, they locked the doors and ran the windows up. Near Point Pleasant, West Virginia, October 1967 night, three men driving along Route 2 sighted a tall, broad-shouldered, dark-caped man walking beside the road. They stopped and looked back, but the figure had disappeared. There were open fields on both sides of the road. Point Pleasant, West Virginia, November 2, 1967 late night, a woman working in her kitchen heard a loud squeaking sound coming from outside. She looked out and saw a huge shadow spreading across the grass, and then a figure described as tall, man-shaped, and gray in color appeared. It glided quickly across a field and disappeared into the woods. Point Pleasant, West Virginia, December 22, 1967 late afternoon, soon after the local Silver Bridge had tragically collapsed killing dozens, Mary Heyer, a local newspaper stringer, sat in her office sifting through the list of casualties, when two strangers walked in the office. They seemed almost like twins, both were short, with dark complexions, and somewhat oriental in appearance. Both wore black overcoats. They seemed only interested on the UFO activity in the area and asked several peculiar questions, including, "What would you do if someone did order you to stop writing about flying saucers?" Mrs. Heyer did not see them leave. Later that afternoon, another stranger walked into the office. He was slightly built, about 5 feet 7 inches tall, with black piercing eyes and unruly black hair. His complexion was even darker than the previous two visitors, and he also looked oriental. His hands were especially unusual, with unduly long tapering fingers. He wore a cheap-looking, ill-fitting suit, and his tie was knotted in an odd-fashioned way. He did not wear an overcoat, despite the fierce cold outside. He spoke in a peculiar stammering monotone and argued with Mrs. Heyer about UFOs. He soon left and later visited the home of several local witnesses. Men in Black and the Mothman. The first encounter of the Mothman took place on November 15, 1966, by David and Linda Scarberry and Steve and Mary Millette. The two couples were traveling late at night in the Scarberry car. They passed the West Virginia Ordnance Works, an old abandoned World War II TNT factory. They noticed two red lights in the shadows by an old generator plant. After stopping the car, they realized the lights were the glowing eyes of a large creature, shaped like a man, but bigger, maybe 6.5 or 7 feet tall, with big wings folded against its back, according to Roger Scarberry. The couples were terrified. They fled and reported what they saw to the police. They were not the only ones who encountered this creature. On the 16th, Mr. and Mrs. Raymond Walmsley and Mrs. Marcella Bennett were going to see some friends who lived near the TNT plant. When Mrs. Bennett got out of the car, she realized there was a figure lurking behind them. It seemed like it had been lying down, slowly rising up from the ground, large and gray, with glowing red eyes. Mrs. Walmsley ran inside and phoned the police as the creature walked onto the porch and peered in at the couples through the window. The entity fled before the police arrived. During these strange encounters, something terrible happened to the town of Point Pleasant. On December 15, 1967, the Silver Bridge, which connected Point Pleasant to Ohio, collapsed. It plummeted to the depths of the river, killing 46 people. The event was heavily investigated, and the only consensus of the collapse was a small manufacturing flaw in the single eye bar suspension chain. The believers in the Mothman sightings would say that the two events are connected. Witnesses and believers even claim that the Mothman appears before upcoming disasters. Between 1966 and 1977 there were over 100 eyewitness encounters with the creature. Jeff Wamsley was among the few people willing to discuss his personal knowledge of the events. Mr. Wamsley has lived in Point Pleasant his entire life. I actually live in nearby Gallipolis, Ohio, now. I was born and raised in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, right down the street from where those original witnesses lived back in 1966, said Wamsley. I grew up hearing about the Mothman sightings. I was always interested in the story because it took place literally in my hometown. I was lucky enough to launch 2 book projects that contained exclusive interviews with many of those original witnesses. I have collected archives for years and run the world's only Mothman museum. I ran my own chain of record stores for about 15 years. Mr. Wamsley now teaches graphic design in Point Pleasant at the Career Center and High School. But the Mothman was only one of the mysterious things that occurred in Point Pleasant during this time. UFOs were often reported, including eerie encounters with the MIB, Men in Black. The Grinning Man, as many refer to him, was supposedly in Point Pleasant as well. The best-known Grinning Man was Indrid Cold, who appeared during the Mothman sightings. The first encounter was on November 2 of 1966. A man by the name of Woodrow Durenberger was driving home after work when he heard a sudden crash behind him. A strange vehicle shaped like an old furnace firing soot and embers at both ends sped by him and stopped, blocking off the road ahead. A tall thin man stepped out of the car and approached Mr. Durenberger. He approached with a broad grin on his face and said his name was Indrid Cold. The two men had a brief conversation about the Mothman sightings, and then Mr. Cold left. There were a number of other encounters with a Mr. Indrid Cold after this night. All descriptions matched, but no explanations. Jeff Wamsley briefly mentioned such strange things that he remembered during his childhood. The UFOs were here before the Mothman stuff started occurring. The MIB were here asking witnesses and others a lot of questions. Some witnesses were too scared to talk to anyone about what they saw. So there have been other strange occurrences in Point Pleasant. Actually, the Mothman sightings are just a small part of all that was going on here. It seems that while Point Pleasant is known only for the story of the Mothman, there is obviously much more to uncover in this small town.
Tomorrow, we will cover Indrid Cold and the end at being Point Pleasant. I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel as more Greentext will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.